that map is helpful at all, just for people to see it, but just we talk about all this stuff and we finally dawned on us, we probably ought to put a map up there just so you can see how small Israel is compared to all the other countries in the area. There's the scope. But anyway. Well, yeah, so this is our last week in this Israel-Palestine peacemaking in Gaza stuff. And what I was hoping we could start with is have Stephanie and I up here just for a minute, just to ask us questions. We still feel like we need to have this a little more interactive and make sure that people are feeling comfortable that if they've got concerns, they get to speak them. This has been controversial, I know. We've tended to be more concerned at this stage in the game about Israel's exceptionally gruesome war in Gaza, the tens of thousands of people, including sick people in hospitals and children that have been killed in this, what some people are calling a genocidal war. We've wanted to be pro-Israel. We've named their concerns. We've admitted that they've got enemies are all around them that until recently said, we don't even think you should be here. And so some countries are sworn to the destruction of Israel. And when your neighbors swear to destroy you, it makes you a little edgy about your security. But the Palestinians, up in the West Bank, the PLO runs them, have agreed to negotiate with the Oslo Accords and so on. And so there's been some hope there. The Hamas organization gets elected through some screwy stuff. We talked about that in the Gaza Strip down in the other corner. And they're less willing to negotiate. But at this point, they hardly exist because the entire, it's not a nation really, but the whole region has just been essentially destroyed, as you know. So then now you got the issues of starvation and no food getting in and those kind of things. So we've tried to be fair, tried to be balanced, tried to be honest, tried to be biblical. But we wanted just to ask. Last week we ended with Stephanie looking at what we called Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism, two different kinds of Zionism that just says Israel is on God's side and we have to do whatever we have to do to get them into the land. And we said that not all Jews agree with that. Many Jews think it's God's business to put them in the land and are against Zionism back in the early 1900s into the World War II era. The Jews have not necessarily been consistent about Zionism, and in the Protestant and Catholic tradition, in the Christian tradition, not everyone believes that there has to be an end time scenario where there's going to be a rapture and a tribulation and Jesus has to return, so you need an Armageddon war to get Jesus to come back, which is what some people believe. Very large lobbying groups in the fundamentalist evangelical world that affirm Israel almost in any case because they think it's part of the end time scenario. So Stephanie explained all that. We wondered just, is there any questions or feedback either to Stephanie or to the stuff I said the week before about the Bible. The last couple of weeks we've been hanging out in the scriptures in the Old Testament and Ezra and Nehemiah and all that. And Stephanie talked about Zionism. Comments, questions, feedback. We just want to have a little conversation if anybody has any input about any of that.
Can you review how Zionism is different from Israel again? Or what I can't remember.
Well, Zionism is an ideology that believes that the Old Testament Jewish people who are in covenant with God need to be returned to Israel. And it became heightened after World War II when they were just massacred. Of course, we know the Holocaust in the show, that's just one of the most evil genocides in the history of the world, when Jews were rounded up by Hitler and massacred. And so particularly after World War II, they said they can't be safe in their own homelands. Some said, we're Polish. We've never lived in Israel. Why would we want to go to Israel? We're German. We're Lithuanian. We're Russian. And so many Jews didn't want to go back, but many just said, we're not safe here. We need our own homeland. So an ideology, a philosophy, a worldview, a political policy developed called Zionism that almost makes an idol out of the city of Zion and says Israel has to go back there. And there are Christian versions of that say we believe in God's people, we want to bless God's people, we want to help God's people return to Israel. Jews said we need a homeland, and so Zionism is the movement to get the Old Testament Jews back to the state of Israel. When it was most talked about in the first half of the 20th century, they said they need a homeland. They didn't necessarily mean a nation state. There was a nation state there. Muslim guys were the mayors of Jerusalem. It was largely Palestinian homeland forever, since most of the Jews left. And now they want to come back and have their land. And so they kicked out the Palestinians from their homes at gunpoint to have what we now call Israel and turned it into a nation state. Is that right, Steph? Is that more or less right?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think I would also say that Zionism is one of those terms that has kind of evolved over time and gets used in different ways. So historically, before the modern nation of Israel existed, it largely had to do with creating that nation. Now, since 1948, the modern nation-state of Israel does exist. And so in contemporary language, when people talk about Zionism, it often has to do with either expanding the territory or hardening the borders or beefing up the power and security and military power.
Because there was the amount that the United Nations said this is where the new homeland will be in the 1940s. And they created it, and Jews went back and started to be there. Then the wars broke out right away because it was handled pretty brutally. And so Arabs fought back. They said, you can't take our vineyards and our homes. We've lived here forever. Nope, you got to leave. Civil wars broke out. It was awful in 47, 48. And so there's been animosity. In the 60s, late 60s, there was what was known as the Six-Day War, where Israel fought back over Arab attacks and took over victoriously a lot of land. And they say, okay, we're keeping this land now, so the heck with the old borders, we're keeping the new land because we rightfully conquered in this war in 1967. Well, the United Nations and nobody has agreed with that. Everybody ever since then has said, no, you got to go back to the original borders at least. You already took people's land. Let's keep it where it was. And they're like, no, we're keeping the West Bank. We're keeping this territory because we want it for right in a war. So it really goes back to the border question of 67 when Israel expanded their borders. And then they said, as Stephanie said it, and we mentioned this one week, that the settler movement is we're just going to have people go camp out and build suburban gated communities and stuff. We're going to build new communities in these areas that are where the Palestinians are allowed to live. And so they're annexing more and more land, pushing the Palestinians into refugee camps where they hardly have any land anymore, the Gaza Strip. And so you got these folks that have lived in essentially refugee camps for their entire lives in hardly any clean water, hardly any jobs, often attacked. Anytime they form a political organization, will be arrested. The mass arrests of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza has gone on for decades. Thousands upon thousands of people just arrested. Not unlike what happened in South Africa with apartheid, where black guys would organize and say, this is our country too, and they would be put in jail just for saying that. So the oppression and repression of Palestinians has caused them to say Zionism is the enemy. They don't always hate Israelis. There are nice Israelis. There's anti-war Israelis. They don't hate Jewish people. They hate Zionism as the ideology that's taking their land and saying God wants the Palestinians pushed off the land because it's Israel's land. Is that adequately put, Steph? Am I overstating?
I think that's mostly fair, yeah. And of course then we talked about last week how in American politics today, there's a strain of American Christian Zionism that interprets some Old Testament prophecy or Old Testament promises made to Abraham and Abraham's offspring in a very odd way to say that that means that we as a nation of the United States have to bless Israel by giving them military aid. And if we don't do that, we are out of step with God's will. And so there's a whole sort of strange political, theological mashup that feeds into that Zionist project in America from people who are largely Christian, not Jewish at all. So yeah.
My only question was, in the biblical times, returning to the land of Zion.
Yeah.
Was Zion defined then? Was there a map?
Yeah, so originally it was a particular hill in the city of Jerusalem. But then as we looked at some passages last week, that specific local spot kind of became used as a synecdoche, as a metaphor for Jerusalem as a whole, for God's people as a whole, for the state of dwelling in God's presence as a whole. So yes, it was a very specific location, but it also was used kind of metaphorically in a broader sense. So when you read the Psalms and they talk about Zion, it kind of intermingles all of those ideas.
And there was the original promise with going to the promised land, as they said, the land filled with milk and honey. After they wandered in the wilderness in Egypt, they were trying to get across the river. And just like there was an exodus out of Egypt, there was a crossing of the water where it had to divide. And we don't talk about that one as much, but they went across the river into the promised land with Joshua. Moses never got it. And one of the things Brueggemann said in that book we were using is he said it's interesting that the land that was promised, the promised land, the original founders never got it. Moses died before he went there. And so there is a sense in which in the Old Testament, the promised land is always just out of reach. We're sojourners moving towards it. It's always in anticipation. It's a promise. And so Abraham, the New Testament tells us, is saved because he trusted the promises, because he lived into the promises, not because of anything he did, but he had faith that someday the promises would come true. But that's sort of the nature of land in the Old Testament, is it's still not always owned. It's something we look forward to. It's something we long for. And then in the New Testament, we're called sojourners who are always on the road looking for a heavenly city. So then it becomes a metaphor for heaven, for the end times. So whether there was a literal map, there's cities that are mentioned and lands that are mentioned and peoples that are mentioned in Exodus and Leviticus way, way back. So there was some sense that, yes, this was going to be Israel's land. But of course, the other seed of Father Abraham was Ishmael. And his children were still there too, Hagar and all that. Other questions, please.
In my brain, everything is a puzzle, and I put the pieces together, and usually the more pieces you get, you find the solution. With this study, and I'm grateful for it, the more pieces I hear, the more hopeless I feel. Are there solutions? Is there a way to have a lasting peace in the Middle East?
That is the million-dollar question. We're going to talk in the second half of today about potentially some gestures in that direction. It is, I think, one of the most difficult geopolitical problems in the world today, if not the most difficult. It's a hard one.
Yeah. And we now have millions of traumatized people.
Yeah, which only makes things worse. Yeah. Yeah, Betty.
Might we suggest that humanly it's not going to happen? You know, we're talking about God's plan here.
Yeah.
So, I think we. I don't know if I can express this. I'm sitting here thinking. I'm in another Bible study where we are studying Genesis, and we're just at the part where Jacob has been, is telling the promise to Joseph, passing it on to Joseph, and the promise is always of a land. There's no question about it. There is, it's troubling to try to get that out of the equation because you can't. It's always been part of it. And and the Old Testament, not the part that we're reading right now, but the Old Testament is filled with wars over
Yep.
the land. And God directed wars, which is really troubling.
Yeah.
There's the whole history of the land is of struggle and turmoil and wars and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But God has made some promises, and I don't think we can cut him out of the
Yeah.
equation when we're talking about.
Such an important
And
point.
Israel today is maybe all of this is part of the punishment for not receiving their Messiah. I mean, I have no message from God that's telling me that. I'm just weighing all of this. What have the Israelites done now that God is upset with them about? Because that whole Old Testament is filled with that kind of thing. So
Just in case everybody didn't hear, Betty is reminding us of the promises of land in the Old Testament, the wars in the Old Testament, even overland, and that this is God's problem, that ultimately God has got to make a way, and that it's humanly possible. It is just so vexing. I don't know what we're going to do. But we want to line up with what God is doing. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that's a very arcane way of looking at things, and was used against the Jews for a long time. Is this? Well, the Jews didn't accept Jesus, so this is why we can persecute them. This is why we don't have to
Yeah.
accept them. It goes back
Have you experienced that kind of anti-Semitism growing up? Did you hear that? You were raised Jewish.
The age I lived in, I mean, we grew up
Okay.
really experienced
Yeah.
much. Now, I could hear sometimes people make comments,
Yeah. Yeah.
not realizing,
Yeah.
because I just look
Yeah.
like any
Yeah.
other ordinary American.
Yeah. And of course, Betty didn't mean that as an anti-Semitic comment at all, but you could see how that kind of language.
You hear, people say
Yeah.
things, but other than that, I
Okay.
can't ever say, yeah, I used to
Okay.
experience it.
Kyle.
Well, I mean, I've read Romans 9 through 11 many, many times, and I cannot figure out how to interpret it any different than the fact that the God's covenant with the Jews is in place and has been in place and will always be in place, whether they accept the Messiah or not.
Yeah.
I cannot read it any different because I've read it many, many times.
Yeah.
He finally gets to the point where he says, God is bound all over to disobedience so that God may have mercy on them all.
Yeah.
So Jesus' coming as Messiah and our reception of it as Jews and then as Gentiles doesn't eradicate the existing
Yeah.
covenant that God
Right.
made
Yeah.
with all of creation, but
Yeah.
also specifically with the chosen.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Jews who were to be a priesthood to the world, to bring word of God to them.
Yeah.
So for me, as far as peace, I think of where Mother Teresa grew up. It's a good example until the genocides happened. So, like you had Eastern Orthodox, you had Roman Catholic, you had
Muslims.
Muslim, all within proximity of each other and dwelling for hundreds of years in peace. And then, what happens? You have in India a balance that's been struck between the Muslims and the Hindus. And then you have Modi come on the scene and use and manipulate Hindu nationalism. And now Muslims are being
Persecuted.
persecuted. So it's, can we have peace? Yes, we can. And for hundreds of years, yes, we can.
Yeah.
But it just takes one bad leader or a group of people to allow a bad leader into position to where everything gets really jacked up.
Let me just comment real quick on just something random. This isn't exactly on the heels of this, but it's something that. Oh, please.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Kyle. I think just kind of drawing a few of these strands back together in response to Sally's comment about, where do we find hope? This just reminds me of this, classic tension that we find ourselves in as followers of Christ, that on one hand, we are absolutely called to work actively and diligently for peace and justice, and we are called to take that seriously and work as if our actions matter. But on the other hand, at the same time, we are ultimately not going to be the ones who bring in God's shalom, that only God can do that. And that both of these things are true, that we have this really high calling to be agents of God's love and justice in the world, and we're not going to be able to do it ourselves. And so I think keeping both of those things in mind is always a challenge.
Yeah. Thank you. Please.
I just have to say that the most intriguing thing for me happened the first lesson, the first day. And that whole pro
Yeah.
concept was just absolutely mesmerized by that.
Huh.
And you take a look at that pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-Jesus, pro-peace. That has applications when you walk out the door to this church.
Yeah.
And pro can be any community issue. It can be pro-black and brown, pro-peace, pro-thriving community.
Yeah. And we might even ask you to talk a little more about that in a couple minutes. That's might be a good place where we can end, is this pro, holistic, common ground stuff has applications even with other issues in our citizenship here. So let's hold on to that, because we want to end, that's our big ending right there. That this is this kind of understanding each side and being agents of conflict resolution in our own towns right here and now is sort of where one of the ways that this can be played out. Two quick Bible verses. Here's a Bible story. In Luke 19, Palm Sunday, Jesus goes into Jerusalem, right? And he weeps over Jerusalem. I think two things are going on there. We don't have time to study the text, but it just came to my mind. Two things are going on there. One is Jesus says, you don't know the things that make for peace. They were called to be peacemakers as God's own covenant people. Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, is the city of Shalom, the city of peace, Jerusalem. And so it is a city of peace, and he wept because they didn't have the skills to know or the passion to know what it meant to be peacemakers. It also seems pretty clear that he's weeping over the impending judgment. As God in the flesh, he knew what was going to happen in 70 AD when the Romans took over. And if we think the first Babylonian exile in Lamentations, when they were carted off to Babylon, was bad, and we talk about that being so important in the flow of the Old Testament, the deportation and the destruction of Jerusalem in the 6th century before Christ. What happened in 70 AD, just within, Jesus said, some of you yet standing will see the end times. Well, that was the end times for them. 70 AD, the streets flowed with blood, and Jerusalem was destroyed. Jesus knew that there was going to be destruction in Jerusalem, and he wept over that because he knew their judgment. And which kind of resonates a little with Betty's question, that there was some cosmic judgment happening in 70 AD, and the city was destroyed, and the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. And he said, you don't know how to get away from, you don't know how to be peacemakers. So that was just something that sort of comes to my mind. Another thing of hope, the Telos group that came up with this pro thing, made by a conservative Republican fundamentalist who worked for the Senate, a Republican senator, and a liberal Palestinian Christian in the West Coast. The two of them got together and started this Telos group. And every single week we've suggested you get out a computer and look up the Telos group, because they've got tons of platforms and scholarly pieces and recommendeds, ways to be peacemakers in the Middle East. They've got more stuff on their website of ideas that they've done and programs they've done than you can shake a stick at. So the Telos program, if you want to get in deep and follow through, would be a good place to look. But it also happens in real human scale things. I just want to read two real quick stories from a book that is a collection of essays called Christ at the Checkpoint. The Palestinian Christians in Bethlehem have a conference every year to help talk about their struggles. And one of their guys is Sami Awad, who I've met once years ago. And Sammy's a Palestinian Christian. And he realized that to have a heart to be pro, he had to understand his Jewish enemies better, the people that were so repressing his neighborhood and so forth. And he decided to try to build relationships with Jews. It ends up him going to the Holocaust sites. And so he makes regular pilgrimages and takes Palestinians to Auschwitz so they can feel the burden and the sorrow of what happened to the Jews. And he talks about being there in this one chapter, and he's remembering the movie Schindler's List, and he's out on the train tracks where the death camps were and so forth. And he said he's there, and one thing that we saw continuously every single day were groups of Israeli children who were brought by Israeli guides to visit and to experience the death camps. They would come in with Israeli flags wrapped around their backs, singing very Israeli patriotic songs, and they would go around in this one day to visit all the sites that I mentioned. Then they sit with their guide in a circle to talk about their experience. The guide would begin to explain the situation. You can imagine these children. Maybe most of them had grandparents, great uncles and aunts that were killed, maybe even in Auschwitz itself or any of the other death camps around Europe. So they were going through this trauma and shock, 13 to 16-year-old children, of what they experienced. And then these guides tell them, guess what? That's not it. It's not over. This is not just our history. This is our present and our future. I'm sitting next to them in a circle as a Palestinian, listening to Israelis tell them, if given the opportunity, the Palestinians are going to do the same thing to us right now what the Nazis did. This is why we have to be strong. This is why we have to be in the military. This is why we have to do what we do, because we want to prevent it again. And the Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, they would use these three words over and over, the Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. They're going to do the same thing to us that the Nazis did to your grandparents. So children in Israel are being taught not only that they have enemies, which they do, but that there's Nazi-like people that want to exterminate them. It's just the worst sort of disinformation. It just isn't true. 99% of Palestinian and Arab people don't want to have mass genocide of Israel. They just want their homes back. But this is the kind of propaganda that's leading the deep war. But then listen to this other story. You know Tony Campolo? He's preached here, an old Baptist preacher, one of the funniest, best preachers you ever heard. Campolo was in this conference, and he was talking about things. And he says, I was in the airport and he saw Peter Arnett, who was a war correspondent and eventually a correspondent at CNN. Some of us old enough that used to watch the news know that he covered Vietnam and he covered other stories. He sees Peter Arnett in the airport. And he says, hey, Peter, you know, I'm a storyteller. I'm a preacher. I always need good stories. You're just coming back from the Middle East. Got any stories here? And Peter Arnett says, oh, yeah, I do. I was in the West Bank gathering a story in a small town when a bomb went off and it blew people all over the place. Israeli troops moved in quickly and fenced off the whole area and wouldn't let anybody in or out. In the midst of these shocking circumstances, a man came running up to me with a bloody little girl and said, Mister, she's going to die if we don't get her to the hospital, and the Israeli troops won't let me get out of here. And if I do, I'll be at the checkpoint, and they won't let me through the checkpoint. You know, these checkpoints, you can't even get kids to the hospital there. You're in the press. You can get through, can't you? Peter went on to say, at great risk, I put the man and the little girl in the back seat of my car, covered them with a blanket, and was able to get them through the checkpoint. As I was hustling as fast as I can to get to the hospital in Tel Aviv, I could hear the man holding the little girl in his arms and crying and saying, she's going to die. Can't you go faster? Please go faster. And the man was crying. I kept going as fast as I could, and it seemed like forever before we got to the hospital. We rushed into the emergency room where doctors took the child from us and took her in for care in the operating room. The man and I sat on a bench, completely dissipated, drained of all our energy. Then the doctor came out of the room, looked at the man and said, I'm sorry, she's gone. And the man started to cry, Peter said. I put my arm around him and said, I have no children myself. I can't tell you what to do or feel. I don't know what it's like to lose a daughter. And the man stood up and exclaimed, daughter, this Palestinian girl is not my daughter. I am an Israeli settler. She's not my daughter. But maybe the time has come for us to treat every child, whether that child is Israeli or Arab, as a son or daughter. I think there's some of our hope. That you have people on opposite sides themselves having encounters where they see the humanness of their enemy. I mean, peacemakers want God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, and so we want to facilitate that kind of conversation. But the Spirit has to do it where people's hearts are touched. He just assumed that this was a Palestinian father. Here it was a Jewish settler who took this little girl into the hospital. So those kind of stories bring me great hope, I think. We can do that in our own communities too, around race and other kind of topics. Well, it is an ongoing crisis. The crisis didn't begin in October when the awful, horrific attack by Hamas happened in October 7th, because that very year has been one of the worst years in Palestinian human rights questions in decades. The number of people killed, the number of people arrested, the number of people homes who were taken has just up over the last year. So 2023 was a hard year for Palestinians. Water shut off, electric shut off, hospitals being closed, doctors being arrested. And so kids are dying long before October 7th. It's been going on for decades. But this has been a hard year. And the number of civilians killed in Palestine by Israeli attacks before October 7th in 2023 was thousands. Thousands. We don't hear about that. We hear about the awful thousands killed on the massacre on October 7th, and we've heard about the war dead. And how disproportionate that is. But the number of thousands that were killed in Palestine in 2023 alone is more than what were killed on October 7th. Not that that justifies October 7th at all. Never say that. But as just understanding the lay of the land, there's been tons of Palestinian children killed in 2023. So we just need to be aware of those facts on the ground. The Presbyterian Church has been involved in this kind of stuff. And so, Steph, maybe you could tell us a little bit. We'll do that later if we have time. Is that all right? She's not ready. Okay. One of the things we can do to move forward is continue to learn. And I'm a bookseller, so I wouldn't be doing my job if sometime in these 6 weeks I didn't mention a couple of books. So, ladies and gentlemen, here's the infomercial. Let me get a couple out. Some of these might be in our church library, probably not. You could buy them at Hearts and Minds and then give them to the church library. But let me just tell you about 4 or 5 real quick books. This Burning Land, if you read my Book Notes newsletter that I do in my bookstore every week, I highlighted these last week and had some links to our class, by the way. I was talking about us in our newsletter. This Burning Land is written by a woman that works for Fox News and her husband who works for the New York Times. So they're politically a little different, and they lived in Palestine as a husband and wife. They lived in Jerusalem for about 20 years. And they covered the war and talked about both sides, people they met, incidences they met, historical things that happened. This is the most balanced, fair, interesting overview. It is not up to date because the book was written about 10 years ago. But up to that point, it covers more than almost anything I know. It is called This Burning Land, Lessons from the Front Lines of the Transformed Israeli-Palestine Conflict. And every week I think I want to quote this book, and I just never have time. But there is more insight from these two couples, and they raised their daughter there. They saw suicide bombings. They went with prisoners. They went in the tunnels. I mean, they've just done everything. So it's great, firsthand, easy-to-read reporting, and you learn so much by both sides. The authors are Craig Meyer and Jennifer Griffin, and they finally left about 10 years ago. Here's a rare book. You don't see much. I learned this from the Telos website. It's called Side by Side, Parallel Histories of Israel-Palestine. And you open it up, and the one page is the history of something that happened from Israel's point of view. On the other side, it is the Palestinian point of view. And so you get all these episodes, a group of Jewish and Arab, Israeli and Arab educators were looking for a resource, and they were each telling their own side of the story. And they said, let's get our heads together and do one book and say use it as a college textbook some places, where they literally side by side show two different views on all the key topics that have happened in the last 25 years. Side by side, it's edited by Sami Adwan, Ewell Navah, and the Research Institute in the Middle East, which is called PRIME, P-R-I-M-E. Really useful. If you want just a tender story, has anybody ever heard of the lemon tree? This has been a bestseller, and it's about an Arab guy and a Palestinian who wants to come and find a tree from his garden that he grew up with, this lemon tree. An Israeli settler owns it now, and they decide to let the guy in. And it's about the friendship of these two families, an Arab family, and they trace back their history, and the Israeli family. They trace back their history. It's just a nice sort of memoir. An Arab, a Jew in the heart of the Middle East, won the National Book Critics Award by Sandy Tolan. They made a children's edition of it. I heard they were making a movie out of it. But it's riveting. It's a good story, but you learn, again, both sides of how people have experienced and suffered over the years. My favorite book on this stuff is called Blood Brothers by Elias Kakor. Kakor is a priest, a Palestinian, a social justice activist. Some call him the Martin Luther King of the Middle East because he is committed to nonviolence. But as a Palestinian Christian, he born in the town where Jesus gave the Beatitudes, and he started a school for Arab kids in this town, although Israel didn't like him doing it. But Blood Brothers, the dramatic story of a Palestinian Christian working for peace in Israel, Elias Kakor, really, really useful. And again, there's videos of him online. If you look him up, he's at the Telos website. Munther Isaac is a Lutheran pastor in Bethlehem. Yes, that Bethlehem, which has a big Lutheran church and Bethlehem Bible College there. And this is called The Other Side of the Wall, a Palestinian Christian narrative of lament and hope. And it's his experience as a Palestinian who is a Christian, and the stuff that he hears when he travels all around the world, and the experiences of his own parish there in the area. So that's really useful. Munther Isaac, published by InterVarsity Press. Let me just close with this one. This is a novel. It won all kind of awards, really highbrow, creatively written. If you like really creative fiction, it's called Arpegion. It's by Colin McCann, award-winning New York Times snooty writer, really expressive, beautiful, creative guy. This is based on a true story. He's Irish, by the way, that this Irishman learned about a Jewish man and a Palestinian man who were angry at each other, became friends at the end, and realized they each lost a child in the war, in the Palestinian conflict. And it's about the friendship of these two men who both have lost kids. It is one of the most stunning, creatively written literary books you've read. It won a National Book Award. Brilliant, powerful. Colin McCann, but again, showing sort of both sides, if you will. This book drew him. He came to write it in part because of the Telos Group. He's on their board now, and he's been working with the Telos Group, this Christian ministry of peacemaking in the Middle East, and he gave voice to some of that in a creatively written novel. So just wanted you to know about that. So we got novels and memoirs and politics and both sides. thought some of those resources would be helpful as we continue to study and learn and grow, because this is going to be a battle for the rest of our lifetime. And if we want to step into the occasion and be what God wants us to be in the world, we just have to know more. And so I've been trying to learn for the last decade or so, and these are just some of the resources that have been helpful to me, and you might find them helpful too. Thanks. Ongoing education.
The word telos, does that mean something?
It means the end.
The end.
Telos is Greek for the end, the goal, what you're looking for. The Telos group has this goal in mind where everybody gets to flourish, because they said there can be no peace unless each side feels not only secure, but able to flourish, happy in their land, shalom. And so Telos is the end or the goal.
Jack.
I apologize for going backwards a little bit in the discussion, but what I was thinking about when we were talking about the idea that the Jews were being punished because they didn't receive Christ. I think that idea, okay, without commenting on it theologically, but that idea has been used in Europe for a couple thousand years. And Hitler was pretty much just the pus running out of the boil. Because there was hatred of Jewish people, and it was often rationalized by that idea that they were Christ killers.
And we looked at that last week a little bit, quoting Luther and even Calvin. So yeah.
Yeah.
So
We
my policy
covered
has
it.
to go back to.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right to say it. That is true. That very notion has been an undergirding movement of anti-Semitism and pro-violence forever. We've said that every single week.
What I want to say about it, though, is that hatreds get used by political leaders, whether it's Caesar or some king in medieval Europe, or whether it's modern politicians. We use hatreds to gain a following, to gain support, and we divide people. And we just need to be very aware of where that is happening in our own minds and in our own communities, in our own political parties.
Yeah.
Because that is timeless.
Yeah.
Well, I might be going back a little too far.
Yeah.
It's
But
predictable.
Yeah, it is predictable. Exactly. And I don't know how we get beyond that other than looking inside and critiquing our prejudices.
As the person that apparently started this whole conversation about, what I was talking about, the Jews and, is between the Jews and God. That's what, what is God saying? What are they, I wasn't talking about our judgment on them. I wasn't talking about, being anti-Jew because they were Christ killers or anything like that. I was simply talking that when you read the Old Testament and read some of this, God dealt with them in His own way, in His own time. And we would, I think, be foolish to not take bring about, because we certainly should be working toward it, but we can't leave God out of the equation because this is His show.
Yep. Amen. Yep. Jack, just a real quick comment. You're so right about this, which is one of the reasons, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I did a quick little survey, and then I think I said it again the next week, about idolatry. That good ideas, fair ideas, analysis of things can become so important to you that you're willing to kill for them, and they become ideologies. Idols become ideologies. And when you see an ISM behind a word, caring about Zion's fine. When you turn it into Zionism, capital is good. But when it becomes capitalism, Marx may have something to say, but when it becomes Marxism, anytime you see an ism, well, in the cross it becomes a wasm, for starters. That's my little saying. That was funny, wasn't it? That ideologies finally end up being bankrupt. But when you see these kind of movements, not just a bad guy, but a guy that's turned these hatreds into a movement, and that's exactly what Jack was saying, that you have a political leader that'll take and rile up people's anger, turn it into an ideology, and then you've got an idol in your hands. You've got an ideology in your hands, a political party in the extreme. So a discernment about when politicians are doing that, dividing people up with their hatred, turning blacks against whites, Jews against Arabs, like that becomes a thing. And I think you're absolutely right. So that becomes an idol, and we have to learn to.
Respecting authority is reflected in Romans.
Yeah.
And acting, saying that God has placed these authorities in place. And that's an interpretive problem, because sometimes I think God wants us to act to stop authorities.
Yeah. Yeah. In principle, in theory, but of course some would say that even Paul, who was in jail when he was writing that, was rolling his eyes in satire. Like the Roman Empire's put there by God, like, yeah, right. So the question of how you handle Romans 13, but yeah, political leaders are to be respected, except when they're not. And when they become a Hitler, and then you say no, because they're ideologically an ism. Yeah.
But historically, the only way to end these isms is by force, it seems. And that's merely oppression.
Unless it's Jesus riding a donkey instead of a war
Right,
horse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, but like
Or the Marshall Plan versus the Treaty of Versailles. So,
Yeah.
Treaty of Versailles after World War I led right to World War II. The Marshall Plan kept us from World War III, I think.
Because they did what the Bible says, feed your enemies when they're hungry. So there may be alternatives, but you're right. Ending those kind of bad guys by force, that's why we end up with authoritarian fascism. Yeah.
It does say in Romans 7:15, for the things I do not want to do, I do, but the things I do not want to do, I do.
Yeah.
But if I do the things I do not want to do I agree the law is good?
Yeah. That's helpful. Yeah, right on. Good. Okay, Steph, take it away.
So we talked about continuing to learn and study. We've talked a bit about being aware of our history. We've talked about interrogating our own idolatries. And this question of how do you actually make a difference in a world in ways that are nonviolent is a big one. It's really hard. And so I want to give a little bit of a brief overview of ways that the Presbyterian Church has been attempting to do that. Whether or not it's successful is up for debate, but this has been the approach that our denomination has taken. And of course, caring about issues of justice around the world has been important to Presbyterians for as long as there have been Presbyterians. But the sort of particular focus on Israel-Palestine, I think in our church, I think largely dates back to 2004, when a group of church members and their pastors from a church in Gainesville, Florida, took a trip to the Holy Land. And it started out as just a normal, sightseeing trip. But on that trip, they got to know some Palestinian Christians and got to witness some of the ways that they were being oppressed. And it blew their minds, similarly to some of the reactions that we saw in the video that we watched the second week. And so they introduced an overture to the General Assembly, the national governing body of our church. And what they did was they asked the committee of our church called the Mission Responsibility Through Investment Committee, which is a committee that tries to make sure that all of the money that the Presbyterian Church has that go into pension plans and investments, to try to make sure that it's invested responsibly. And they asked that Mission Responsibility Through Investment Committee to begin gathering data to consider a selective divestment, taking their money out of investing from companies that were facilitating or profiting from violence in Gaza and the West Bank. And the first sort of step of this plan was to engage in shareholder engagement, to say, hey, we own stocks in your company, we have a seat at the table, we want you to be more humane. That didn't work. So they began this process of figuring out what does it mean to invest our money, of which the denomination has, quite a bit. What does it mean to invest it in a way that is promoting justice and not promoting violence? So that process began in 2004. It took a little while. Another big step along the way is in 2010, the General Assembly adopted a report from the Middle East Study Committee called Breaking Down the Walls, which was the first biggest study about the facts on the ground in Israel-Palestine and what a theological response should be, emphasizing a lot of the things that we've been talking about in this class. In 2012, they actually took a really interesting step of encouraging churches and individuals to boycott products that were made by Israeli companies in factories in the occupied territories. So companies that had seized land from Palestinian homeowners and farmers, built factories there, and were profiting. They were encouraging boycotting those particular companies. Not all Israeli-made products, not all Israeli companies, but specific ones that were producing in factories in the West Bank and in Gaza. Then in 2014, some of you who have been members of the church for a while may remember this, was when the PCUSA decided to divest, to take their money out of investing from 3 big companies that they determined were not facilitating peace in that region. And those 3 companies were Caterpillar, which provided bulldozers that were used in the destruction of Palestinian homes and for clearing the land of fruit and olive groves in preparation for construction of the barrier wall and settlements. The second was Hewlett-Packard, which had extensive involvement with the Israeli army, and at least at the time, provided electronic systems at the checkpoints, and they provided communication systems to support the naval blockade of the Gaza Strip, which kept, food and medical supplies from being able to enter. And then the third was Motorola, which provided military communications and surveillance systems in the Israeli settlements. And so that decision was made for the money that was controlled by the denomination in their investment funds to divest from those 3 particular companies. And they also didn't mandate, but encouraged, presbyteries and congregations to consider doing similar things. So their approach has been to say, how do we apply nonviolent pressure? How do we not, go in fighting and killing, but how do we use the resources at our disposal to try to build justice and peace and stability? And so at the same time, they were investigating ways to invest in peaceful and humanitarian projects in that region. So thinking about what we do with our money and who that money is going to, who it's facilitating, what kinds of projects it's making possible. And are those projects for peace and justice, or are they for violence, has been a big theme in our denomination's attempt to engage in this issue. And Jack, please.
I agree completely with that strategy, but I don't know. Has there been any repentance on the part of Caterpillar, Motorola, or Hewlett-Packard?
That is a great question. My understanding is, I don't know if it's repentance, but I think that Hewlett-Packard has been corporately reorganized, and so I think there's actually a motion coming, one of the motions that is coming before the General Assembly this summer is actually to consider removing Hewlett-Packard from the divestment list. The rationale is that they're restructured and are believed to no longer provide systems or services that might contribute to the conflict, is what the overture says. Whether or not that's true, I have no idea, but that's one of the proposals that's coming before the General Assembly this summer. Whether that has anything to do with people boycotting them or not, great question. I'm going to pass some of these out. So of course there have also been tons of study documents, tons of resolutions, tons of statements of public witness affirming the human dignity of both Israelis and Palestinians and calling for justice. This flyer that's being passed out is an insert from the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance Organization, who does just what the name sounds. They do assistance in situations of both natural disasters and human-made disasters. And so they have 3 real calls to action here at this present moment. The first is donating money for humanitarian relief in specifically Gaza. As you know, you've seen on the news, it has simply been destroyed. And so rebuilding homes and hospitals and schools and infrastructure is going to be a project that takes generations in the long term. And in the short term, just food and medical supplies are in dire, dire need. Sanitation is abysmal. Kids are dying of starvation. So the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance Team is trying to be helpful in that situation. The second action step they call for, here it says act, and their plea is to urge the U.S. government to advocate for an immediate ceasefire and the end of the blockade on Gaza to ensure urgent access to humanitarian aid, and call for engaging a diplomatic solution to the conflict. So they're saying, you know, we have to tell our government leaders that more violence is not going to end this, that we need to find a diplomatic solution. We need to call for a ceasefire. We need to urge the parties to come back to the table.
Steph,
And
can I
then-
just say a quick
yeah,
word?
please.
Our two senators